Hey, I'm Hamish Dickinson. Welcome to my recording studio, Phoenix Sound in Mansfield, Nottinghamshire. Today, we're doing a quick video regarding drum recording using only one mic, two mics, three mics, and four mics. We'll go into the live room and I'll show you what mics I've chosen, where I've chosen to put them, and what I'm hoping to achieve through those microphones. Once we've done that, we'll pop back into the control room. I'll show you what we've got done on the computer, we'll listen to the individual tracks and setups, and then I'll do a quick mix down, show you what processing you can do to enhance the sound that we've captured and get somewhere in the ballpark to a usable and finished sound for your project. So here we are in the live room. This is our drum setup, and I'm going to talk you through what we've got set up, why we've picked those microphones, and what I'm hoping to achieve from those. So if we start with the first one, which is an Aston microphone, it's the Spirit. It's a large diaphragm condenser, and it's positioned just here above the kick drum and just below the ride cymbal. It's set to omni-directional, so it's picking up everything around it. And the reason I've put it here is so that we can try and get as much of the kick drum sound as we can in the low end, which we're losing from not having a kick on the interior. It's positioned roughly equal distance between the rack tom and the floor tom, and also the center of the snare drum. The idea behind that is to try and get a balanced overall kind of capture of the whole drum kit, given that we're only working with the one microphone. So that's our first microphone setup. I've also got a 20 dB pad on that. Naturally, given that it's really close to some of the loudest volume parts on the kit, it's important to make sure that we've got the volume under control on the gain staging side of things. After that, we have Beta 52A, which is our kick drum interior mic. You can pretty much use any old microphone for this, as far down to something like an SM58. I probably wouldn't go with an SM57 just based on the fact that they don't have an awful lot of bass response. Ideally, something that's designed for a kick drum, so either an AKG D112 or the Shure Beta 52A, which I've got in here. So that's that. There's nothing special going on. It's just not directly at the center of the batter head to avoid getting too much click and too much of the overall kind of air pressure that's traveling through the drum when you beat it. After that, we've got a snare drum microphone. This is a Beyerdynamic M201. I've chosen this microphone just because it has a slightly better kind of low mid response around the 200 range, 100 to 200 range, which normally is where you get most of the body of any snare drum. It also has a very, very clean and crisp top end as well. Again, other mic alternatives that you can use is your standard SM57, and anything else that's kind of a durable dynamic microphone that's got a fairly kind of sweet, kind of crisp top end, and preferably something that gives you some sort of low end so you're not having to EQ too much in when you go to process it. After that, we've gone for a Glinjon setup, which is probably one of the better ways of getting an overall sound of your drum kit when you're just using a few microphones. So we've got an SE5 large diaphragm condenser mic over the top here. That's kind of picking up the crash and the hi-hats and the snare crack. And then we've got an Aston Origin microphone down here, which is kind of looking directly across the drum kit. These two are spaced equally apart at 40 inches from the center of the snare drum. Nothing really overly special going on with either of them. They're just here to basically give you a bit more of a stereo width when you bring those into a mix. And this gives you a bit more clarity of your toms, especially your low end from your floor tom and your kick drum. And this is kind of giving you the overall brilliance of the cymbals and the crack of the snare drum. So all of those things together, the setups will be the single mic as just one channel. The two mic setup will be the the Spirit and the Beta 52A. The three mic setup will be the Spirit, the Beta 52A, and the snare drum microphone, which is the Beyerdynamic 201. And then the four microphone setup, we are completely omitting the omnidirectional mic, and we'll just stick with the Beta 52A, the M201, and then the Glinjon setup where we've got the SE5 and the Aston Origin. So let's go and see how it sounds. So we're back in the control room now, and what I'm going to do is run you through what we've just captured in the live room. I will play all of the different setups soloed out so you know exactly what they sound like before any processing has happened at all. Once you've heard that, I will show you what I've done to process them and how I've gone about doing that and why I've done those particular processes, so you're able to see what the differences are and hopefully incorporate some of these processes into your own recording. Let's check it out. So the first setup that we've had is the Aston Spirit, which is the single microphone setup. It was set to omnidirectional, so it's picking up everything around it rather than what's just in front of it. What I've done with this, and to be honest what I've done with most of them, is just add compression and EQ, as I feel like you can achieve pretty much exactly what you need using just these two processes, and pretty much every DAW that you can buy will have these incorporated into that as well. Not necessarily look exactly the same as this, but they'll all do very similar things. The other thing I've done with this is added a reverb, which we'll talk about in a little second. So let me go straight into the compression. What I've got here is a very simple compressor. All it's got is a ratio and a threshold and then a makeup gain. I've chosen this because I like the sound of the fixed attack and the fixed release on it. I feel like it adds a bunch of punch that you maybe don't necessarily get fiddling around with some other compressors. I've also tried to keep it as simple as possible so that you guys can follow along. It's very simple. It's just a 2.9 to 1 ratio, and the threshold is at minus 21 dB. No makeup gain, it's just as is, and that's all I've got going on there. I feel like all this does is just lift out a bunch of the low end that you don't necessarily get because we haven't got any direct microphones on the toms or the kick drum. The other thing this does is just smooth off some of the snare transients that you get that may be a bit pokey every now and then. So that's all that is there. With the EQ, I've done a few little bits, nothing major. All this one here is to give a bit more depth to some of the toms, pull out some of the low end. The attack is totally fine on them, so I've kind of not really done too much other than pull out the low end of that and the resonance. So that's that one. That's just a tiny boost, 1.5 boost at 100. At 205, I've just boosted a bit of the body of the snare drum. Naturally, using the type of microphone that we've got and its positioning, you're getting quite a lot of sort of top end attack that is great, and you hear a lot of the ghost notes and a lot of the accidentals, but you don't necessarily get an awful lot of body. So that's what I've done there. I've dipped here, 1.5 dB dip at 710 Hertz. That's basically, there was just a noise that I didn't particularly like. I think it might have been within the cymbals or the clash between the cymbals and the snare frequencies. So I've dipped that out a little bit and it's kind of cleaned up that area. This dip that I've got here was specific to the drums that I was using. There was just a very nasty ring from the sort of ping of the ride, and given that the microphone's proximity to the ride is incredibly close, I just notched that out so that it wasn't quite as harsh and didn't sound quite as kind of, not necessarily distorted, but just a bit horrible. Quite a large boost, 3.5 dB boost on the sort of 7K upwards, just to pull out the brilliance of the cymbals and kind of give a bit more energy to the overall sound of the drum kit. And I've rolled off a bit of kind of low end energy, not really any sonic sort of benefit to this. That's just to clean up and give myself a bit more headroom on the channel. So overall, that's what that's doing. And then, given that we're just using a mono microphone and I wanted to add a bit of stereo space to the drums, I've added a very small, quite short reverb just to kind of open the drums up a little bit and put them into a bit more of a space. So let's take a listen to what that sounds dry and then with the processing on. Setup 2 is the exact same processing on the Aston Omni microphone that we've got, but we've also introduced the Beta 52A, which we had on the inside of the kick drum. Again, the processing is exactly the same pretty much in terms of what we've used. We've got a compressor and an EQ, and again, very little going on. 4 to 1 on the ratio for the compression, and minus 22 dB on the threshold. So again, not doing a huge amount, but just really taming the kind of harder hitting of those kick drums, and I guess giving some sort of glue to both the Spirit and the kick drum together. I feel like this just helps bring the low end punch through a bit more as well. EQ wise, nothing crazy again. I've pretty much taken out entirely at 350. I find that that's just kind of where a lot of the boxy and sort of wooliness of a kick drum sits, and you don't necessarily need that. I feel like it just kind of eats up a bunch of space and a bunch of headroom, so we've got rid of that. On top of that, I've done nothing to the low end, I've left it as is. The Beta 52A is designed to have a very punchy low end anyway, and I don't tend to find that I need to add any more low end in. Normally it's about mic positioning on this one, and you generate as much low end as you would want. I've added a couple of boosts here. I've got one at 4K and one at 5K, and that's pretty much just to add a bit of click and bring a bit more attack into the kick drum. Normally I might attach a microphone to the kind of batter head and pick up a bit more of the slap of the Beta, but given that we're trying to do this on as few mics as possible, I've just EQ'd this back in. Let's have a listen to how that sounds. For the third microphone setup, I have the addition of the close mic on the snare drum, and again, nothing crazy going on. It's a compressor and an EQ, super simple, and we've also added in another bit of reverb here, which we'll get to in a second. In terms of the compressor, I find that with most snare drums, having a faster attack time and a fairly fast release time tends to work slightly better. It just knocks off those transients, really harsh transients, a bit quicker. And I find that that works better for what I'm usually going for. And to be honest, across most drums, snare drums in all genres and styles, this tends to work quite well. Ratio at 2.8 to 1, and again, minus 20 dB. Not doing anything crazy here, just knocking off a couple of the really high-end transients again, just to control that snare drum. So that's really all that's doing. It's not doing anything crazy. The EQ here, we've got a complete roll-off down here at 50 Hz and below. That's just because there's nothing really that a snare drum generates that sits in that area, so that's just to give us a bit more headroom. I've got a tiny little notch at 200, 1.5 dB boost. That's just to give a bit more body to the snare. I wasn't achieving quite what I wanted, so I've just added a tiny bit there. I've got a 2K boost here at 5 dB, which is quite a lot. That's just to give a bit more kind of definition to the ghost notes and the accidentals on the snare. And then a 3.5 dB boost at 4K and above, shelving just to bring in a bit more of the kind of energy and attack that you get from the snare. The two cuts that I've got here are just resonant frequencies to this particular snare drum if I ever use this snare drum in any session, these tend to be notched out fairly quickly. It doesn't really matter what head or what tuning you seem to put onto it, these always seem to be there, and they're just not very nice. Just a deformity of the shell, I think. So those have gone as well, and that's all that's going on here. Again, nothing crazy, nothing drastic, all very doable for anyone. I also have a bus set up here to a stereo reverb. Again, given that all three mics that we're using at the moment are mono mics and there's no kind of major panning going on, I wanted to add a bit more space. So I've gone and used a fairly short plate reverb. I've bumped up the width on this, so you can either do this if you have plugins that have a width parameter in them, you can do this in that, and if not, Logic and most DAWs have a stereo spreader and a stereo imager built in. That's set, I'm sending a full bus send to that, but I've controlled the overall level of that with the fader here. So yeah, let's have a listen to how that sounds. So for the final setup, which is the 4 microphone setup, we've completely omitted the Aston Spirit, which was the omnidirectional, and we're just working with the kick and the snare, and then we've put in those Glinjon overheads, if you remember from the live room bit. So the processing on the kick and snare is exactly the same as it was on the last two. We've left that as is, nothing crazy to do there. And then what I've done with the overheads is I've sent them both to their own bus, which is this one here, and on that bus I have compressed and EQ'd them together. This just saves on processing power, but it also is just the way that I've always worked, and it's the way I like working, so this is how I've done it. This one, I've got a fairly smooth kind of compression going on. I've got a 4:1 ratio, fairly slow attack, just to let those kind of splashiness from the cymbals come straight through, and a fairly slow release to kind of let the decay on those last as long as they need to without being affected too much. The threshold is fairly low. This is just to make sure that when the drummer's really grinding in on the take, that it's controlling those frequencies and smoothing them out at the top end. So that's what we've got going on here. In terms of EQ, there's nothing wild here. I've got a fairly large boost at the top end, and that's really just to pull out the kind of splashy and explosiveness of the cymbals and try and add as much energy in as possible to that performance. After that, I've got a 1K boost here. Again, that's just lifting out a bit of the snare in the overheads as well, which is the same as this. So this is the top end of the snare, and then the 200 is the body of the snare. Again, just notching those two up a bit so that we can get a bit more snare out of that. And then what I've done here is a fairly loose bell curve around the sort of 100, 150 kind of area, and that's just to pull out the resonant from the toms again. I haven't rolled off anything from the bottom because I like to make sure that I've got as much of the kind of kick and the overall sort of low mids and low frequency here, just to really generate the punch from that. So that's all I've got going on there. Everything else is as you've already seen. So why don't we take a listen to that and see what you think. So that's it. As you can see, you don't need thousands of pounds to get a great drum recording. In some cases, you just need one microphone. I'd say the most important thing to remember is to try and use a drummer that you believe is really good, and try and find a room that has a fairly decent decay and natural ambience. After that, it's just a case of where you position your microphone and what you're hoping to achieve. So I hope you found that helpful, and I hope you find a way to use some of these techniques in your future recording projects. If you want any more information or you're looking for any more advice, feel free to comment below and ask me any questions. I will do my best to answer everything. Thanks for watching.